Hello everyone, this is AJ and welcome back to the channel. Welcome to a new episode of my comic book movies retro reviews. Yes, where I take a look at those films that came before what we're being spoilt with today with the MCU and DCEU. Those forgotten comic book movies that no one gives any time to anymore. But here I am, giving them time. So, today we're going to be taking a look at Marvel's Man-Thing. So, let's get into it. Okay, in 1971, Marvel created the character of the Man-Thing. Yes, this was a character that first appeared in Savage Tales issue 1 in May of 1971, created by writers Stan Lee, Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway and artist Gray Moreau. And he went on to be featured in various titles and his own series, including Adventure into Fear. Now, as a comic book character, Man-Thing is a comic book that I've never read as an individual character, but I'm aware of the character and he has appeared in comic books which I have read, so I do have a passing understanding of the character and all this sort of thing. So, in 2005, with a sort of turbulent history before that of getting a release, which will come on a bit later in the trivia section, Marvel finally released the Man-Thing. Well, it was actually made by Lionsgate. They had the rights to it and they made this movie. It was released on April the 21st in 2005 with a 15 rating and a runtime of 1 hour and 33 minutes. Now, this film was actually made on a budget of only $5 million, but went on to gross a lot less with $1,123,000. So it wasn't a hit whatsoever. But again, we shall talk about that in a moment. Now, this film stars Matthew Neves as Carl Williams, the sheriff, the primary character of the story, Rachel Taylor as Terry Richards, and it was directed by Brett Leonard. The film was written by Steve Gerber and Hans Rodionoff. Kevin Feige of the MCU fame does actually act as an executive producer on it, with Avi Arad as producer. And music was done by Roger Mason, who has done some stuff but nothing I've ever really been aware of or anything like that. So this film is sort of set in sort of the deep south of America, that sort of area, where you've got these oil tycoon who's utilising the swampland to what's underneath the swamplands, and sort of illegally getting oil, but at the same time damaging the environment. There are 47 missing people in the area, and this new sheriff comes into town, Carl Williams, and obviously he starts investigating all of this. He meets up with Terry Richards, played by Rachel Taylor, who's a sort of activist. She's a school teacher, and they're trying to block the works done by this oil tycoon and his company. With the disappearance of all these people that the sheriff comes to find out about through his deputy, he starts investigating all this, and it leads him into the swamplands, where there is some mysterious stuff going on, where it turns out that there is this creature that is actually killing people that enters into the swamps. You've got these sort of like locals of the area, like Native American type individuals, who do a lot of hoodoo voodoo type of stuff, and they tell the stories of what is the creature, the Man-Thing, that's out there in the dark parts of the swampland, basically dispatching of people. So that's the basic premise of this film. Now, a very, very difficult character to bring to the screen, I will admit this. I've sat down, I've watched this film. Again, I watched it upon its release in 2005, but I haven't seen it since then. So that's like 17 years, 16, 17 years in which I haven't seen it, which is a considerable amount of time. So, my thoughts on this film. I'll be honest with you, first thoughts is it wasn't as bad as what I thought it was. I was quite surprised by the level of language within the film, the level of violence, and the fact that there was nudity in it as well. This is certainly not a movie for younger generation of comic book movie watchers. The film does play very much like a sort of a horror film. You wouldn't be, if you weren't aware that it was made by Marvel or based upon a Marvel comic book, you wouldn't be forgiven for believing that it was a straight out and out horror film about this creature lurking in the swampland that is killing people. But there's somewhat more to it than that in the sense of the character. The character is the embodiment of the swamp, essentially, of nature, fighting back against the pollutants that we are causing and destroying its land. So by the end of the film, the sort of creature is done when the drilling operation is in effect reduced to rubble. So you don't get a lot of the man thing whatsoever towards the first part of the film, and my memory recollecting back is you didn't see him much at all, so I was pleasantly surprised to see that I did actually see more of him than what I actually remembered, and I didn't mind the design of him or the way they done him, the way that he looked whatsoever. I thought he was fine. Now this character, like I said, is difficult to bring to life on the big screen because he is not a character. He's just this sort of this creature. You can't get any empathy out of him or any emotion, any performance. So you've got to rely on the cast around you to deliver and lift the film up. And this, unfortunately, is where the film fails. Now, the film was shot in Australia. So Rachel Taylor herself is Australian, I believe, or New Zealand, somewhere like that. She's got that accent, but she's trying to put on an American accent. She's not particularly good with it. Yes, she's not particularly great with it. The main guy, Carl Williams, as the film progresses, I got used to him, but he's not an overly strong actor, and the chemistry between them is pretty non-existent whatsoever. The film does lead you to believe that there's a love story or potential love interest between the two, but it seems to come out of nowhere, and it seems somewhat forced. And the fact that they keep kissing after this occurs, and it becomes a bit annoying, to be honest, in that part of the film. It just feels like the film would have been benefited without that element to the story. Your primary bad guy, the oil tycoon, he's acting way over the top, not particularly great whatsoever in it, but you know, and this is, like I said, this is where the film primarily falters, in the characters and the interest that you'd have in these, which is pretty abysmal, pretty low. Now, the film is shot interestingly, shall we say. All the scenes where they go deep into the forest is obviously done on sound stages. It's all done with a sort of green hue to it, a very sort of green lit hue. The posters of the film are very representative of how the film looks in these scenes. It is lit green. So anyway, that being said, the money obviously went into the effects at the end with the monster, and the monster looks pretty damn good. I didn't mind what they'd done with him, and the way he dispatches of people with like these tentacles going into him and pumping stuff into them. I liked all that. It looked very good. It was a bit sort of reminiscent of, I suppose, maybe The Thing, the monster from The Thing, in that sense, with the things all coming out and flapping around, but not the way he looked. He looked pretty damn comic accurate, and I appreciate what they've done with that. This is a character that I'd like to see brought into the MCU, even just for a little bit, and see how they would handle it. Like I said, here they had no other way of doing it but handling it as a horror sort of film, but yes, it kind of lets itself down in that regard. The musical score for the film is fine for the workings and the parameters of the movie and what you get. There's nothing wrong with it. It does elevate the scares, it elevates the atmosphere of the film, but certainly not a soundtrack that you would ever listen to away from the film itself. Yeah, so primarily my thoughts on this film is that I was pleasantly surprised with it. Although it's got its faults and it does get let down in the character area, it kept me watching, and I came away from it and I'd actually quite enjoyed it. I know a lot of people say it is a bad film, and I understand where they're coming from, especially if you take it on face value, being Marvel and this sort of a thing, and you take into account the history of what happened to it upon its releases and all this. I see why people say this, but to be fair, it isn't as bad as what I was expecting it to be, and it's a film I'd certainly consider rewatching again in 5-6 years' time, because I thoroughly enjoyed revisiting this older comic book movie, and that's what this series is about, revisiting. And I'm really enjoying it, because if it wasn't for me doing this series, I'll be honest with you, then I wouldn't be probably wouldn't be revisiting these films, not for another decade or so to come. Doing this series is forcing me to revisit the old comic book movies, and I'm loving it. I truly am. I'm finding it really fantastic. But that being said, let's move on to some trivia for Man-Thing. Okay, there was a test screening for this film that was actually held, but most of the audience actually walked out before it even ended, so obviously not a great sign. After this movie's release, the film rights reverted back to Marvel Studios. Subsequent references to Man-Thing the character have been made throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Co-star Rachel Taylor is a cast member of Netflix's Jessica Jones, also set in the MCU. She plays within the series. Although filming was originally intended to be done in New Orleans, because of the reduced budget, the decision was made to relocate to Australia, where the film would be made for a lot cheaper. The film's budget, like I said, was $5 million, and the film had a worldwide total of $1,123,136. So not a very good haul overall. Yes. Stan Lee cameo. Yes, there is a Stan Lee cameo of sorts within this film. When you see the board of the missing persons, like 47 of them, if you look closely, you will see a photo there of Stan the Man Lee. Filming lasted from late August 2003 until late October 2003. This was originally intended for a direct-to-video release, but later there were plans for a small release to theatres in Spain, Russia and the United Emirates. However, those plans were scrapped and the film sat unreleased until it was later announced as a Sci-Fi Channel original movie in spring of 2005. With the DVD and VHS becoming available in the summer of 2005. So you can see what happened there. People would believe it to be a Sci-Fi Channel movie. However, it was just originally purchased by the Sci-Fi Channel. Now, obviously, I can't talk about Man-Thing without mentioning DC's Swamp Thing and the thereabout similarities between the two characters. Now, a lot of people believe that Marvel actually ripped off DC with this character, but it was actually Marvel that created Man-Thing before DC created Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing came just after Man-Thing. Marvel did consider taking DC to court over this, but because of similarities to another IP from years before that, outside of the Marvel and DC arena, that decision was ceased, shall we say. Swamp Thing is a film I will be reviewing at some point also. Not just yet, because I'll keep it away from this because of those similarities. So there you go, just a little bit of trivia on the film. Thought I'd throw in for you. But yeah, so ultimately, not a great film, but a film that I actually didn't mind too much on a revisit. I can understand why it's bad, and it's not a great film, and it's not really a film I'd recommend to anyone. Say, yeah, you must watch. If anyone asked me what I thought of it, I'd say it was okay. It was okay. I've seen far worse. I've seen far better. But being that I'm from a background of collecting comic books, I've got a kind of bias towards these sort of films anyway. But it is interesting, a film that I, you know, regarded in quite high regard as Judge Dredd sort of dropped in my opinion on a revisit, but then a film lowered down the scales like this has gone up slightly. I'm not saying they've overtaken or anything like that. I'm just saying one's dropped slightly and one's gone up, and that's what's happening on these sort of revisits, these films. But that's just great. That's fantastic. So let me know your thoughts on this film. Have you seen this Marvel film? Did you even know it existed? Let me know in the comments down below. And let me know your thoughts on it if you have seen it, or if you're now going to go and hunt it down and watch it and that sort of a thing. I don't mind hearing bad news about the film if you didn't like it. That doesn't bother me whatsoever. We've all got our own opinions on stuff. I love hearing difference of opinion, and that makes talking about it interesting. So hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, leave that comment, and come back in 2 weeks' time for another comic book movie retro review. See you then. Take care all, and goodbye.